So my name is Jessica. I'm the program coordinator at MacEwan, and welcome to Affirming Learning Environments. I am excited to be here, and I hope you are too. So first of all, let's just take a moment to situate ourselves. Beautiful Treaty 6. Just the winter in Treaty 6 territory is just astounding. The River Valley, thank you. But instead of reading you the typical script, I want to just talk about treaties in general. Treaties are relationship agreements that outline how we interact with one another. And as we are all treaty people here in Treaty 6 land, when we call to mind the treaties, it's a reminder of our responsibilities to our fellow treaty people, so to each other, to ourselves, and to the earth. And it's especially appropriate during Pride Week to celebrate the diversity and call to mind all folks who are still working to dismantle systems of oppression. And we're grateful for all those who have lived here for thousands of years and continue to live here and model the right way forward on a good path. So at MacEwan, I run the Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity. If you're from MacEwan and you don't know where we are, we're right in the corner there in Roundhouse, right in there, and you can come see us. We do a whole bunch of different things on campus. Pride Week, obviously, research supports, soft place to land, community gatherings, surrogate families, we can adopt you. It's all good. But we do a lot of really incredible things, and I encourage you to check out our website and our social media feeds to find out more. And finally, it is Pride Week, and this Pride Week is extra special because we are working in collaboration with our other Northside Pride schools, 4 out of 5 which are represented today in this session, which is amazing. So we have Nate, Norquest, the Kings, Concordia, and MacEwan, which is a really beautiful thing. Now, this isn't going to be a sort of 101 session where I go through a lot of vocabulary and, we talk about the basics. I'm hoping that people come here with a bit of a foundation in these topics because I will be speaking to you as if you know, but there are sort of 5 concepts that that every person should know, period, but in order to make sense of this workshop. And so those 5 major concepts, we could spend 17 hours talking about each of them, but in its simplest form, we understand these terms like this. We have sexual orientation, which just describes who we are drawn to, who do we seek intimacy with, who do we want to be with. That is your sexual orientation. And there's a myriad of terms that can talk about the specific kind of sexual attraction that you seek, as well as romantic attraction. When we're talking about sex, we're talking about the more of the medical binary categories that people are assigned to when you emerged into the earth. Whoever your baby catcher was took a look between your legs and said, bingo bango, there's a penis, therefore it's a boy. Those kinds of categories we know are on official documents, and people are really, really married to those ideas of those categories. But then we start talking about gender, and that's when we talk about sort of that socially constructed set of expectations and beliefs about those roles. Historically, we know, obviously, they fall in a male-female binary in the Western sense. There are many, many cultures who have more than that for their understanding of gender, but in the Western sense, we think about it in 2 categories. But then when we break it down, we have gender identity and gender expression. Your gender identity is your very personal, individual connection to your sense of gender. Whether your gender aligns with the sex you were assigned at birth or it doesn't, you get to decide what your gender identity is because that is your relationship to it. Your gender expression is just how you communicate it to others. It's the outward appearance that you use to portray your gender. So your hair, your makeup, your tone of voice, your pronouns, your name, all of those things are part of your gender expression. What's important for us to realize as instructors and as allies and as community members is that not gender expression does not always match a person's gender identity, and often that comes to a sense of safety, that people don't feel that they can express themselves fully, express that to others for a number of different reasons. And these identities, all of these are very fluid concepts that can change over time, change as a person knows themselves better and knows the options out there better. And but everything that we talk about boils down to a basic understanding of these 5 broad terms. Are there any questions about those 5 broad terms so far? You can pop it in the chat or unmute at any time. No? Clear as mud, right? Awesome. Okay. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on vocabulary, like I said, but I have a very strong example of why thinking about language is so important. And I am hilarious. You need to know that to be in this session, and thank you for laughing at my jokes. We're good? Yes. All right. So I identify, well, my identity is shifts all the time, but I often use the word pansexual to describe my sexuality because it's, I like the colors of the flag. You can judge if that's the right way to choose an identity, but I love how bright and sunny it is. But here's the thing, often, too often, I have forgotten how often when I share like, yeah, I'm pansexual, I get the response of, does that mean you're like attracted to pans? And I mean, there's a place for that joke somewhere. I haven't found it yet. And I used to kind of just humor it or just like earnestly try to explain, like, no, I love my cast iron skillet, but I don't love my cast iron skillet. And I finally just kind of realized that when we do this, when someone shares a part of themselves, especially when it's a marginalized identity, and your first response is to make a joke about it or demean it in some way or be really dismissive of it, that tells me as a queer person everything I know about you, that you are not willing to take a moment to pause and think about the words coming out of my mouth before speaking the words that come out of your mouth. And we have to be really careful in those kinds of situations, because even though you might think you're making light and you're being jovial, you've really just put a lot of pressure on myself to defend my existence. You've put the labor on me to validate my life for some reason to you who can't think about your words. And of course, this is the royal you. I know that no one in this space would do that, but this is one of those microaggressions that makes it really, really challenging to navigate spaces, and that's the same for any person who has been pushed to the margins, is that we are ultra in tuned to those kinds of things. We just it makes my teeth hurt. Like, I have a really weird physical reaction when people respond that way, because really we know how language works, right? We don't always think about it, but we were taught how language works and how new words are formed and root words and where they come from. And if we can pause for one moment and think about that, if we know that the ending sexual refers to your sexual orientation, then the first part is the information you need. Pan just means all. We use pandemic every day, pan meaning all. Epidemic means it's in one place. Pandemic means it's everywhere. So once we start thinking about the words a little bit more, we can take that pressure off of people. We can just say, and even if we don't understand it, so if someone comes up to you and says they're pansexual and demi-romantic, you can say, wow, that's really, really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And then go and Google it later, or just think about, okay, I have a part of an understanding, but that's all I need to know right now. You don't need to know who I want to sleep with to respect me. You don't need to know, have the exact terminology just to be like, oh, that's great. It's cool that you know yourself. You know, we do not have to have these deep vocabulary lessons at every single moment, because people are capable, even if they're not willing, they are capable of figuring it out for themselves. So, of course, when I'm in teaching situations like this, I'm going to be very generous. But if someone on the street says this to me, I'm more likely to just kick them in the shins. That being said, if there are terms that come up during the workshop that you're not familiar with, feel free to pop it in the chat. There's lots of really knowledgeable people in here that could probably answer it more quickly than I could, because I might miss it at the beginning. So please feel free to do that. And if there is something in the chat and I don't see it, folks, just, you know, wave your hands or something. Sound good? Everyone's good so far? Okay. And then just a very quick introduction to gender, because I want to get to the strategies. I know that that's what you want as well. Gender, I mean, gender is so complex, but also so simple at the same time, and I think that's why it's really hard for people to wrap their heads around. But we have always been taught that gender is like you're at one end of this or the other, and that this sliding scale maybe moves between. And that's because we've been taught that a spectrum is a straight line with two end parts. Like in high school, when you learned about ideologies, that's what it was. You were on the left or the right, and everyone was sort of a sliding scale. Gender is not a sliding scale. It's not that I'm 32% female and I don't know the math for what percentage I would be of male, because math is hard. It's not how it works. And so we need to start thinking about it in a little bit more complex way. Another model people try to use in like different points to come to a center and have it, which I think starts to get at a little bit more, but it's that problem of like a 2D model for such a complex sort of concept. And so I really want to invite people instead to think about gender like acrylic fluid art. I don't know if any of you have ever done paint pouring or watched it. You need to watch it. It is like one of the most amazing things to watch. Just zone out and watch paint pouring. But basically what you do is you prepare your canvas, and then you take your acrylic paints, you thin them with water. Sometimes people add stuff to it. But then you basically pour it in a number of ways onto the canvas. Now that is the end of your control over the process, because all of the physics that are going to enact on it and you tilting it, you cannot control how it is. Every single thing that you do in paint pouring is going to be different, and it's going to draw on all of these different colors and color combinations and movement to create something extremely unique. So if we can just like follow that metaphor a little bit, the colors represent all the things that influence in our lives. Who are our gender role models? Who do you model your look after? Who do you want to be? What is the cultural, the linguistic, the historical, the personal influence that comes together that creates a gender that's nothing but yours? And I think viewing it like this and thinking about paint in its fluidity is a really important piece for understanding other people's complex gender journeys. Any questions about that? I'm going to show you my favorite video from TikTok. I love TikTok. People who know me know I love TikTok. And there is a little bit of spicy language in here, so try not to clutch your pearls. But I think this is like the best video I've seen that really demonstrates how personal a gender identity can be. Okay. I want to do paint pouring. Yeah, it's so much fun. It's so much fun. We're gonna have a paint pouring night in the center. We'll do craft nights. It'll be fun. So here is this video. I hope that you can hear it.
I want to know what your individual personal gender spectrum is in this. All right, boys, let's break it down. Sure, this is a graph. Also, bear with me, I just painted my nails, so if I'm being like weird, then just, yeah. This graph represents my gender. And no, it is not from man to woman, because I am non-binary. It's fuckboy to manic pixie dream girl. Around here-ish is little boy in the 80s, and around here is about 1950s housewife. It's like girly, but not quite as girly as manic pixie dream girl. And now for the y-axis. I now have them labeled. Yes, I did take statistics. It was 2 years ago, but I took statistics. Down here we have compromise, and up here we have fuck everybody, anarchy. About here we have roast them with facts and logic. If you haven't seen me before, I'm a leftist, so don't come for me for being a right-winger or any. Around here-ish is I accept your faults and I'll try to educate you, which is generally where I am at most times. Smack in the middle is my favorite, no emotion, which is where I'm not particularly feeling like anything that day, any which way. I just feel like an amorphous blob that shall not be perceived, okay? I shall not be perceived when in the middle. Now things get interesting depending on where I am on the spectrum of this. If I fall into this quadrant, I am just some happy chick with closeted rage, which means I am a manic pixie dream girl phase, and I accept compromise. Now in this quadrant, where I am most of the time, is crazy rainbow feminist, which is the cross between total anarchy, roasty with facts and logic, and being a manic pixie dream girl. If you look in this quadrant, which is crossing fuckboy with anarchy, lol, you're dead. I am very rarely ever here, but if I am here, I have been here maybe once or twice, and I remember yelling down the street at a cop when I was in this phase. And in this quadrant, I say it's nice lesbian TikToker, you know, those kind of more mass-presenting lesbians who are just like, it's okay, girl, you're gonna be just fine. That's the cross between fuckboy and compromise. That is what this quadrant means. So, ladies and gentlemen, my gender.
That was amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a big fan of that video. I think that it's fantastic, and it actually really challenged me to think about my own gender. I reflect on my gender a lot anyways, but I had never seen it discussed with like pop culture references and that kind of visual kind of thing. And I actually found that quite liberating, because I'd always just tried to think about it in like the sliding scale, which is funny to me considering I do this work professionally. But I just really like how people can find their own way to relate to their gendered experience with whatever they have around them and whatever makes sense to them, and that it's all valid. It's beautiful. All right, so I know you're really interested in getting down to the, let's talk about the strategies. Let's talk about learning environments. And this is the crux of it. Then the words I was going to say fell out of my brain, and I need to pause for a second to remember what they were. Oh, right. Okay. So there's a reason why we define learning environments so broadly, that we're not talking about specifically classrooms or, the traditional box that we put teaching and learning in. I define learning environments as any place in which we engage in exchange of knowledge. So that can even be personal conversations. That can be Thanksgiving dinner with your family. That could be the youth club or your church group. All of these are learning environments. And the strategies that we use, that we call on, can be universally applicable. Obviously, we're going to shift our language a little bit depending on the context. I'm not going to go into deep theory with my dad, but the strategies are the same. I think a lot of people are going to view these and say, actually, these are things that I already do. I know those are intrinsic. And that's fantastic. What I'm asking you to do is to think about those things that you already have embedded in your practice, and how we can be maybe more intentional about them, or how we can shift how we model examples. And we can also think about how if you find that you're already doing these things, you can look at what I'm doing not as redundant, but as a different approach, that maybe a slightly different approach from what you've been doing is the key to unlocking some of those things. But anyways, I digress. The most important thing to having these kinds of safer learning environments is to set the expectation from the very beginning. You need to establish the tone and your expectations at the beginning of the class. because you know eventually there's going to be a moment when someone asks that question and you like time slows down and you need to like put a halt on things, and we will talk about that. But making sure that the expectations are set helps down the line. So from day one, when someone enters your teaching space, we are modeling those expectations. So some of the things that you can do right from day one are when you and this example I'm thinking is from social sciences. So when you're talking about the kinds of topics you're going to cover, you're very clear and explicit from the beginning that the debate is not on the existence of those systems of oppression. This class operates on the premise that we know and understand what those systems are, and they're working to deconstruct them. You have the weight of academics on your side. The studies that have been done on racism, for example, for decades upon decades, support that this happens. So when people want to discuss issues, when those topics come up, you're able to remind them that in this class we talk about the issues, we do not talk about the people. And when we do it with care and respect. And you're very, very clear about those expectations. Another couple of things you can do is make sure that you have equity statements in your syllabus. Make sure you can use what your institution provides. You can also develop your own, or maybe your faculty can develop their own that fits within that particular context. But having it, I mean, we know faculty love their syllabi, right? And it's very important, and they take them very seriously when they put them together. And it's because syllabi are often looked at as almost like a contract, that this is what I am committing to teach to you from these perspectives, and these are what I am accountable for, and those are the things that you are accountable for. So including it in an official document like that gives it the weight that it deserves. Okay. I also recommend setting out at the beginning specific references to student conduct and guiding policies. So when you make your equity statements, you can list the particular lines in your school policies that support that work. And it shows that you know what your rights or responsibilities are, and you have that expectation for students, which is, you know, it's something that I have done even from my middle school teaching days, because it's modeling that language and it's showing that accountability is required from day one. Okay, I have, so if you're looking at where you are supported by law and policy, we have all the federal and provincial laws. I don't need to list them off. The Charter of Rights of Freedoms, the Alberta Human Rights Act, marginalized identities are protected in there because of the acknowledgement of those systems of oppression. So we know that one person's rights are buffered by another person's rights, and that rights and responsibilities are a constant dance that we do as citizens. It's school specific. If you're interested in MacEwan's, we've got 3 specific policies that relate to this topic very directly. So your student rights and responsibility, the anti-harassment policies, and your duty to accommodate, which includes an awareness of people's circumstances that they bring into your learning environment. And you can rely on these. Now, I know that for instructors, I'm not sure if the Chicago principles are in place or in being enforced at the individual institutions, but there's a lot of conversations around like the concept of academic freedom, which is why that most schools do not force equity statements to be put in the syllabus. which I think, that's a whole other conversation that we're not going to get into. It's a question of like being forced to include something. But even though it's not required, it is something that we need to be doing because, as instructors, that there is a balance between all of those factors, your individual rights and responsibilities and those of the students. Okay. I also like to know what the residence standards are because they do cover students who live in residence when they're in their classes. So just a general familiarity is important. These are some statements that we have at MacEwan. So there's a general statement about it that this is found on the website. It's always included in staffing advertisements. It's very common, but it's also pretty broad and vague. So there has been one developed for gender inclusivity specifically. That is available, that MacEwan instructors can use. This was developed by Dr. Christopher Wells, my boss. So it can be trusted, but if you ever need to take a picture of your screen or you want to model any of these or want my slides, I'm happy to share them. But it really sets the tone because it also, you're demonstrating in writing that you are committed to those principles and that you're committed to making sure that your space lives up to that standard. You're basically raising the bar for your entire class and its operation by including these kinds of statements. And it's such an easy thing to do. I mean, those documents are 5,000 pages long anyways. What's another paragraph, right? Syllabus. Okay. Then at the beginning of your term, there's a lot of new information that you have to manage. Students are coming at you with a whole just a whole brand new set of fresh stories. Many of them that might include language that you're not familiar with. So what do you do at the beginning when we're meeting new students? How are you welcoming them in and inviting them to be members of your classroom environment? Because when you have that new information, you're learning new students, you're maybe there's new identities that are being described to you. So there's new terminology, there's new, maybe you have pronouns to manage. We have these intersectional identities of our students, so, all the things that they're bringing with them. And we also have a set of new experiences. And so that's where things like making sure that we have the tools in our pockets for like trauma-informed practices, for understanding current events, all of those things help us contextualize the experiences of our students. And there's different ways that we can garner that information in our classes. One thing that we hear as feedback is profs or instructors or anyone who's really super keen to be doing inclusion work and but don't necessarily think past the first step of doing so. So, for example, when people are doing personal introductions and you're asked to go around the class, so tell us your name and tell us your pronouns. And it goes all the way around the class. And on its face, that looks like a great idea. Yes, we're modeling that it's okay and they're accepted. Of course. However, what you also might be inadvertently doing is outing someone who isn't ready to share that information with people or putting people on the spot. Because what can happen is if you're the only one who has who's like maybe non-binary or trans, or you're the only one who has different pronouns in your class, all of a sudden all eyes are on you. It can really be tokenizing, and it can be isolating for folks rather than the intention of being inclusive. So what are some other ways that you can get that information? What can you do? And I can pose that to the class. Maybe students who are here, you have some great examples of what's been done in your classes, but I'd love to hear some ideas on suggestions for how to manage new information for new classes.
Jessica, I was just thinking because I do teach a lot of international students,
Mhm.
and when I do face-to-face classes, I bring, the McEwan cardboards that you fold for them to write their name.
Yeah.
And in my case, it's for my own sake in order to, be able to say their name properly, or making sure that I put a face to the name, etc. So maybe I was just thinking now that ask them if they would like to share their pronouns, they could do so too. And I would start with myself using it in my own, piece of cardboard, and that you give the people the option to share or not to share, but it's not like everybody will have to share.
Yes, that is perfect. Yeah. So really it is about creating options. So if I'm having people make those things, I ask for what you like to be called, because it might not always be what's on the class roster, right? And I list some examples of things that they might want to include. So I invite them to think about, so what do I need to know immediately about you in this class? And so it could be a nickname, or it could be your pronouns, or it could be anything. And I also allow people to express it symbolically instead, if they don't want to write the words. And the crucial piece of it to think about when we're asking people to be vulnerable and to expose themselves in a classroom dynamic is that for any person who has experienced marginalization, the biggest thing is that we want to be in charge of our own stories. We want to be in charge of our own narratives. And that means also how and when we share pieces of ourselves, not just what those pieces are. So when we give students the option about how to share that information, that allows them to stay in control of their story. Because people will tightly control how they're perceived, especially when their identities can be targets for harm. Some other ways are to do it with not so publicly. And so I know a number of instructors who now offer a beginning of the term survey, where they can do it on paper but also do it digitally, and where you ask those kinds of questions, and you're maintaining that confidentiality or anonymity, and it's an opportunity to check in without the pressure of being on the spot. So some of those things can be, what is the name that appears on the roster? What do you prefer to be called? You can also say, is this something I can call you in front of other people? Because maybe they only want it in their interactions directly with you. What are your pronouns? Can I use this in front of other people? Because it's all about maintaining the individual choice. And sometimes people won't share what they have with you, and that might be because they have been put in bad positions in the past, which I don't blame them. But often that's an opportunity to open up a dialogue, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that can look like. But it really is a chance for you as an instructor to figure out, what do I need to know to serve you best, to make sure that you are successful in this class. And maybe it's like, I can't hear it in my right ear, but I don't need supports. I'm just always going to sit on this side of the classroom. Great. Thank you for letting me know. I'll make sure not to mumble. There's all sorts of things. Olga, you have your hand up, my friend.
I have a question. I was teaching some students in China, in Wuhan University, and I was here in Edmonton, and they were taking English as a second language. And I remember sending them that questionnaire beforehand, and I can tell you that 99 of them chose a nickname being an English name, and I don't know how to handle that. Because I think they feel they have to give you an English name so you can pronounce it. And because it's an English class, they had to do it. When I was growing up and I would attend English classes myself back in Mexico, I was asked to choose an American name. So my name is Olga Emma, and I had to say Amy because that was my English name for Emma. So I feel that in many cultures, especially, in China, they still feel that they have to choose an English name instead of us taking the time and care to pronounce their names. as correctly as we can.
Yeah.
So how would you suggest we handle that situation?
Thank you for that, Olga. That's a really important conversation to have. I mean, at its heart, those are practices that are holdovers from colonialism and white supremacy. I mean, there's no other way to justify that, and it is a common practice in many places to choose to have your traditional name, like your name for where you're from, and then your English name. There are a few ways to approach this kind of thing. I think that again, giving people the option. So it can be, you know, what is your traditional name, and what do you want to be called in this class, and you can maybe craft some questions or some conversation around the fact that that is something that people should try a little harder just to make the words work. But at the same time, I have been told by many people who have names that are often mispronounced because of language barriers that they don't want their name to be butchered because it's hurtful to them. And that they would rather be called something else and hold their name precious. Like, they want their name to have the same weight when it's spoken. They want it to be carried with the same weight that someone who knows them and loves them would carry it. And so it really just depends on the class. Something I would do, especially when I was teaching in high school, is that I would preface it at the beginning that I like to pronounce names properly as a show of respect, but I also don't want to disrespect you by saying your name incorrectly. And then if you would like to teach me, or I'd like to practice, but I'm not going to make you be my mirror as I mispronounce it 500 times, right? So it's really, it's about showing them that you can be trusted with it, and then maybe later on in the term that they'll open up to the opportunity for you to know their real names. It's really just about, it's more about creating the environment where people feel that they can share their full selves rather than the specific activities that can elucidate, like that can get some information for you. It's not really a direct answer as to how, but it's just to consider some other approaches, I suppose, Olga. Yeah. All right. It's a great question. And I'm glad you asked it, because like all oppression is related, right? And these things are important. Okay. In terms of pronouns, I know people still struggle with pronouns, and personally I find it baffling, but I think that's because I'm neurodivergent. It's just like, these are pronouns, of course I'll use them, but I know that it's harder for people, for lots of people. As instructors, or even as just community members, you know that the conversations around pronouns are still expanding. Most of your students are still going to probably fall under she or her. Increasingly, the third most common is to use the singular they, which, by the way, if anyone ever gives you a hard time about, it was common practice until the early 19th century, no, the early 20th century, to use they in written language, the singular they, not he or she. Specific gendered pronouns only came into fashion after that. So anyone who tries to claim that it's not linguistically proper, it's grammatically incorrect, they're wrong. Because we use the singular they all the time. We use it. Oh no, someone forgot their jacket. I hope they come and pick it up. We use it. It's not that hard. I know it's hard, but it's also not that hard. Then we have other pronouns that are called neopronouns or neologisms, which just means that they are new terms. They're just new words that have been created to help people express their individual pronouns. All I can really suggest, folks, is that you practice. You practice using neutral pronouns, using the they, them, and incorporate that, practice that, and think about all the ways in which you can use that. So it is now just habit. People I don't know are always going to be they until they confirm to me otherwise. because I would rather be expansive and inclusive than to pigeonhole someone. It doesn't mean that I don't mess up sometimes, but we are in charge of our language. We have complete control over it. So it's up to us to do the work to make sure that we're using it correctly. Okay. And I'm going to let you just read my little gifts while I have my things as I have a sip of coffee. Yeah. Using pronouns is the easiest way that you can affirm and validate someone, because it is just saying, I see you, I've listened to what you've told me about yourself, and I respect that. You're still going to make mistakes, of course. Everyone is going to mess up. But when you're approaching things with an open heart and in good faith, these kinds of things really make a difference. Okay? I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about intersectionality and these intersecting kinds of oppressions. That's another course that's a whole PhD dissertation. But basically what we need to know is that every person, the influence of all of these things for every individual person is going to create a completely unique experience of the world, because every one of us, we contain multitudes, and it can be really easy when we're working with people who are expressing their marginalized identities to just boil them down to that one point, instead of understanding it part of like a complex experience, like a spider web. Everything is interconnected. And what happens when we sort of focus on one aspect of an identity or a person, we then are not understanding how all of the pieces are significant. You can't fix oppression by only pulling on one of the strings. You have to look at the entire structure of oppressive systems. And the other thing is that queerness is not a tragedy. Like my queerness is not what creates tragedy. It is the world's response to my queerness and how they treat me because of that queerness. So we're not looking at people as the tragedies. We're looking at the circumstance as a fixable problem. Yes, Olga.
My question was also in regards that I've been trying to be more inclusive in the type of language that you use and the example that I use. But I also have found that images that I use have the same impact. So I teach a lot of business communication courses for corporations as well as for international students mostly. And I, being a woman, I try to make representation of women. And it's hard to find those types of materials, especially pictures for women representation, because if you Google boss, leader, and I can go on, it's always pictures of men. I use unsplash.com because they have really great images that are for free for instructors and education. But it's really hard to find representation not only of women, but of queer people in general being in a leadership position. Yeah. So I was wondering if you have any resources that we could use where we can find those types of pictures, images that we can use in our slide as representation.
Yeah, actually PowerPoint now has, if you go to like insert icons at the top, there's actually a really, it's not perfect, but it has diversity represented, both like cartoon form and real people form. And you can tell that they are committed, they're trying to include more diverse folks in it. I find when I don't find images like of people that I will use graphic art instead, especially like in Canva, you can kind of create your own. But there's lots of like the Creative Commons, where like all of their pictures are free to use is a good one. But also, social media is great. So you can include people like in a TikTok, like I did, where you find someone who embodies what you're trying to portray and you allow them to make their point through their own words. It's really just, grabbing whatever you see. Olga, I have a folder on my computer that's just called useful content. So when I see things that I know might come to good use, save. I just put it in there for the next time, and then I make sure that it allows me to more easily have those at my fingertips. So that's something that I would recommend.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Olga, anytime. Let's see. Okay, we have half an hour. We're gonna do it. Yeah. Okay. So usually our modern now we're gonna put on like the educational academic hat for a second. So the way that we teach is really messed up. And end scene. We follow a model that's very hierarchical and very, I mean, it's very top down. Instructors are the sage on the stage. We hold the magical knowledge that we will benevolently give forth to all of the learners in our care. It's one directional. It's the model we follow: Industrial Revolution, capitalism, yada yada. Again, another long conversation, but we have stuck to this model from all levels, from kindergarten to grad school. Everyone follows this model. And so one way to think about being more inclusive is to think about how we teach. How do we situate ourselves in relation to our students and in relation to the knowledge being shared? So pedagogy, which is theories around learning, children and learning, it's the practice of teaching for kids, is the model that's always been used. But we're teaching adults, we're working with grown-ups, so is there another way we can approach it? If you like fancy theoretical words, I encourage you to look up Andragogy and make sure you're calling it Andragogy. I was with someone who was, they were talking about Andragogy, but they kept calling it androgyny, and that is a completely, like, not even, no. So Andragogy, this was a teacher too. Oh, it was bad. Andragogy just situates the learner and the content differently. So andragogy recognizes that when adults are coming to us with robust lived experiences, and because of that, they have significant knowledge based on their experiences. So andragogy centers the learner and asks them to explore topics as they relate to what they already know. It's just a different way of making sense. So it's there are a lot of really specific strategies that come around with it, but what it essentially does is it allows the person to center their own story, to understand their experiences, and to make sense of the new content being shared. Obviously, when you're teaching like high-level calculus, there's still going to be a great deal of stand and deliver. There's nothing wrong with it in itself, but it's when that's the only way that we allow people to interact with knowledge. Because pedagogy is one direction, but not Harry Styles. And andragogy allows for multiple directions and multiple ways to make sense of the content. And it also creates space for people to interrogate those experiences to create new and better ways of moving forward. This is especially good when you're doing with new learners, adults who are maybe coming back to school after a long break, because being a student who sits in your desk is a particular skill set. So, it's just about bringing in more tools to your toolkit. And so this is a possible place for you to do that. Okay. When we are establishing ourselves in a learning environment, even if I'm dropping in for a single workshop, we take the time to co-create that culture. We are taking the time to make sure that everyone knows what is happening. And what I invite people to do when you're thinking about creating that culture in your classroom is to think about principles of consent. Because especially if we look at the Fry's model, which is from Planned Parenthood, consent is freely given, so you're agreeing to participate in this class. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but true consent is informed, and it is that you are agreeing to all parts of the class, and that you are, as an instructor, you are basically asking for consent for how you interact with people. And that is what makes sure that a person can hold their own narrative. When we're co-creating, we look at ways with our classes to minimize risk. So, okay, in this class, we do talk about some heavy topics, and that are very complex, and people have a lot of, can have strong emotional responses to it. So let's talk about ways that we can make sure that people can ask questions safely and receive their answers safely. You know, like when we're leading with expectations of empathy and respect, then we're able to make sure that we're holding people to that. Another piece that I'm going to come back to that later. And I'm coming back to that other thing later. So when you're co-creating their culture, the first thing that you have to do is ask yourself, do I make biased assumptions? And the answer 100% of the time is always yes. You always will make biased assumptions. You cannot help it. Biased assumptions are products of how you've been socialized. You had no control over how those beliefs came into you, but you're in control of how you make sense of them and maybe shift your understanding. So when you make biased assumptions, it might be in the following ways. Do I make assumptions about gender based on names? When someone comes to you and says their name is Lindsay, do you assign them in your head a male or a female identity? Okay, or any other name? What are the assumptions you're making? And when you find yourself making them, how do you stop yourself? If you don't really know someone well, how are you talking about them? And I try to model this even when I'm referencing like theorists. So according to blah, 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 share it, and they continue to write about this topic prolifically. If I don't know their gender, I'm not going to assign it, no matter how they've presented, because there are a number of academics who, since first publishing their works, have changed their gender identities and have had to go through a lot of work to be able to make that sort of retroactive so people can talk about them and who they actually are. And so why not just start with that until you have it confirmed? We have a weird model. We assume everyone is one thing until told otherwise. I would rather assume less until I'm told otherwise. So it's just, you know, flipping the script. What happens when my assumptions are incorrect? And I'm telling you, how you respond to being corrected says more about you than the mistake you might have made in the first place. This is the make or break of allyship, of friendship, of any kind of relationship, is how we hold ourselves accountable when we've messed up. How do I model the sharing of pronouns, and how do I elicit those from others, which we've touched on? What collective noun do I use when I'm talking to a group of people? Those are all things we need to be mindful of. We're going to go into it with more detail. What I want you to know, though, when I offer you my pronouns, it's not necessarily because it's really, really important to me that you call me she, her. I'm doing it for other folks to show it's more that I can have this conversation with you because I share my pronouns. I'm demonstrating to you that I can hold that space respectfully, or that this space hopefully is safe enough for you to do the same. It's not just about you recognizing my gender. That's my approach. Okay. So inclusive language, we know that language is one of the most important things that we can do. And as I said before, it is the only thing that we actually have control over. So when we're thinking about inclusive language, there's sort of three broad categories that I want you to think about: gendered language, heteronormative language, and exclusionary language. Okay. And they are slightly different, though related. Gendered language is the weird way that we assign language to things. We see it like in like boy and girl colors, which is still the weirdest thing, especially when you're raising a girl child, and they can only wear pink. Like it hurts me. But we do it all the time. We associate professions with gender, activities with gender, certain language, even food, like drinks, girly drinks. It's just so weird because none of those objects actually have, like, they're concepts that don't require gender. Like, you're not operating any of those things with your genitalia. And if you are, I hope you're in the comfort of your own home. You know, like, really think about how and why we assign language. Like, even animals, you know, like a wolf, that's not a girl animal. It's like, how do you think, where do you think baby wolves come from? Like, of course, it's just, it doesn't make sense once you start to break it down, but we need to have an awareness of how we're doing that. Then we know when something is normative, that's what is considered normal or the proper way to do things by society. And because we live in a heteronormative and a cisnormative society, we're not always aware of how our language reflects that. So, you know, it's part of it is, you know, when you meet someone, asking them about their boyfriend or girlfriend or their husband or their wife, you know, it's assuming relationship dynamics, that it's going to be, you know, a man and a woman, and those are the roles that they play. It comes down to spaces and facilities, you know, the conversations around accessible washrooms, you know, safe places to pee. Why does that have to be so defined by cisness? Even things like the products that you buy. Go to Shoppers Drug Mart and you still see feminine hygiene products rather than just maybe menstrual hygiene products, because it's not just femmes who have their periods. So that kind of weirdly specific terminology that we use, like it just re-embeds the incomplete beliefs that we have about people around us. And then we have exclusionary language. So language that actually, maybe not purposefully, but has historically always excluded folks. And one of the big conversations around this is taking place around the concept of motherhood. And people who are resistant to inclusive language, they oversimplify it. And so simple things like, let's think about how we describe parents become somehow, they won't let us use the word mother. Mothers are not valued. Like, it's nothing like that. All we're saying is that not just women have babies. So when we're talking about this kind of like monumental life shift or accessing medical care, when we use exclusionary language, it does create barriers for people to get the support that they need. So when we say pregnant women or just mothers, we're not including folks who don't have those labels. So why wouldn't we use pregnant people, or people who are pregnant, or expecting parents, or, you know, any of those terms that is inclusive and more robust. Same with when we talk about bodies, right? We can recognize that a certain terminology is incorrect. So when we essentialize womanhood with having a vulva or vagina, then we're only re-embedding those bioessentialist, transphobic kind of beliefs. So think about the words that you use, because often the more correct word or the more correct expression is the one that's going to be inclusive when we use specifics. Okay, and oh, there's something in the chat. Did I miss something? Oh, thanks, Brennan. I'm gonna make sure I check that out. I really appreciate that. So safer spaces is an interesting concept because we often think about it in a physical space, like something that's tangible, like a location where you end up. And I want to just challenge you to think about safer spaces in a more expansive way. And instead of looking at it as a destination, look at how you as an individual can embody the values of a safe space, and that you become that safe space for people. You'll see the R in parentheses often, because it's a reminder for me. I use it as a reminder that a safer space is never fully achieved, that you're always going to be having to keep working, because you can never guarantee a safe space because you can't control all the variables. I can do all that I want, but Buddy in the back could still stand up and be a butthead, right? So I cannot guarantee safety, but I can put protocols in space to minimize the harm, okay? And when you're becoming a safer space, you just got to ask. Like, ask those questions respectfully, in good faith. Seek out a buddy on campus who knows, or talk to the students themselves. Like, is there language that I can avoid, that you would like me to avoid because it makes you really uncomfortable? What language affirms you? What can I call your guest today? You know, it's just about being invitational and demonstrating that you don't have all the answers. Coffee break. But despite your best efforts, despite all of the pixie dust that you've sprinkled in the corners, you're still going to have that moment, right? That moment where time slows down and you realize that this is the moment that you have been dreading forever, and you just hope that no one whips out a phone to like record you in this instant. Like, that moment, it's going to happen to you no matter what. It doesn't matter who you are or what you teach. You're going to have a moment when someone opens their mouth, and maybe you see it coming. Maybe it's expected from the Chad in the back, or maybe it's from like the little girl who never says anything in the front, but it's going to happen. So what do we do? First of all, recognizing that conflict is unavoidable is a big part of it. You're never going to be able to eliminate conflict. Conflict is also an opportunity, and so we need to be able to address it head on. We do that with expectations of personal responsibility for ourselves and for others. We do that by making sure that consequences are clearly understood for the actions that we and the people in front of us have. We take very seriously the need to protect the space. And we also understand the anatomy of an apology and the role of an apology in a safer space. Because an apology, which is something that we see screwed up all the time, needs to be part of how we're constantly calibrating and recalibrating the spaces. Because it's important to remember then that if something is said and you choose to ignore it, that the students, they hear what you didn't say. Because when we fail to address issues that come up, we are indicating that when the rubber hits the road, that we do not have our students back. And it doesn't matter how many safe space stickers you have or the fancy language you use, that if you do not address things as they come up in the moment, you are not a safer person. And that trust is really, really hard to regain. When we look at apologies, and it seems weird, like some people might be like, why are you teaching us how to apologize? Because people often don't really do it in a way that's reparative and restorative, which is what apologies are supposed to be. So say, for example, you use the wrong pronoun. So you misgender a student, okay? You used she, her instead of they, them. It happens often, okay? The first thing you do is apologize, but you're not going to make a big show of it. You're going to be like, wow, I'm very sorry. And that's it. Then you're going to identify the harm. I used the wrong pronouns, or I messed up your pronouns. And then you're going to commit to improvement. I'm going to keep practicing until I get it right. And then you're going to actually keep practicing until you get it right. The reason why we don't want to make a big deal about this, because it centers you instead of the person who was harmed. So when you're making a big scene, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? I can't believe I did that. Oh, I feel so bad. Are you okay? The issue is now you're putting that person who you've misgendered in the position of comforting you instead of just doing what you need to do, apologizing, acknowledging what you did, and then working to do better. And this, believe it or not, is actually a model that people don't really know. So when one of the biggest things we can do in our safer and more affirming learning environments is to make sure that we're modeling this and that we do have that expectation of our students when they misspeak. I'm speeding up because that time that at the beginning where I was chit-chatting is coming to bite me. So when something does happen, And the thing is said, and the genie is out of the bottle, Pandora is out of her box. No, that's not how that one works. You know, the thing happened. What do you need to do? So there's a few things. And depending on what we're dealing with, what kind of event it is, will determine the response. Because there's a huge difference between someone who has a lack of knowledge because of a lack of exposure and people who are willfully ignorant. And we know intrinsically the difference when people ask questions, right? Like you can hear it, especially if you are you're used to observing for microaggressions. So you're gonna have to know the difference, because you can use calling out versus calling in. So calling out is usually immediate. There's witnesses, it's direct and to the point. Calling in is recognizing when, okay, clearly I need to address this, but I'm going to talk to this person quietly and privately. I tend to go with calling in first because I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but sometimes things are just not on and they cannot be allowed to continue. We need to understand micro versus macro aggressions. And if you do not know what those are, you cannot recognize them, believe your students when they tell you that that is what it is. I'm not going to be able to recognize racist microaggressions the same way that I can recognize homophobic microaggressions, right? So when I tell people like that was really inappropriate and that is a microaggression, then you believe them because that is their experience and they know. You don't know, they know. You'll often have people who are like, but my free speech. It's like, okay, first of all, in Canada, we don't have free speech. We have freedom of expression. And it has been demonstrated time and time and time again that there are reasonable limits to the freedom of expression. This is a hard convo right now because of like the beep beep freedom fighters and that sort of societal fundamental misunderstanding of it. But one person's freedom of expression buffs up against another person's right to be protected. And no matter what, even if you have the freedom of expression, that doesn't mean that you have freedom from consequences. And it doesn't mean that I'm required to give you a platform. So no matter what people say, even if they try to couch it in those terms, there are still consequences for when we are hurtful to people. Okay, so what do we do? What do we do? And I'm going to teach you these complex things in 9 minutes, right? Do you think, can she do it, folks? Can she do it? So when it happens, what do we do? I have like a 5-step process that I came up with. I'll have to like get it patented and make my billions, right? No. The first thing these are the things we do. We're looking to reframe, we're giving reminders, we're going to recalibrate, we're going to protect, and we're going to resolve. What does that mean? So the first thing that we do, like we've done all the pre-work, right? So we're inviting people they've said something, and we invite people to reframe. The tone is always invitational at the beginning, even if every fiber of your being wants to throw the whiteboard marker at them. Your tone has to remain invitational, because the first thing out of someone's mouth isn't necessarily what they mean, especially if they lack that knowledge because of lack of exposure or lack of impetus to think about these things, which is privilege, and we can talk about that. But when people don't have the right tools, they'll use whatever they have, and sometimes we need to dig in that. We need to make sure that people are safe to be vulnerable. You know, if you're a first-year student and you were like homeschooled in a really conservative home and this is your first time in the big world, you might not have the same kinds of linguistic tools. And asking that question can be really, really hard to do. But when that person asks in good faith, which we can tell the difference between, we're honoring their personal processes because they're willing to learn. It gives an opportunity for self-correction, and we're also modeling those important skill sets. And I want to be clear, asking and framing questions properly in a post-secondary context is a specific skill set that I don't think we spend enough time teaching intentionally. Asking a question is it's not actually a straightforward thing when you're trying to consider all of these different factors. So modeling that and being explicit in teaching that is important. So some of the things that you can do, I'm very good, probably because I'm adorable, at feigning ignorance and asking for people to like explain it to me. And that will usually tell me what I need to do. And then I flip into being a smart ass again, and it all works out. But it's really about taking a pause and not reacting right away. The second one, the next step to it is to give that reminder of expectation. Remember, we talk about issues, not people. Remember, we fully acknowledge that these systems exist. You need to couch your declarative statement in some kind of literature. You need to frame it so that it makes sense in this class. We encourage people to be intentional with their questions. So that means being reflective. We're emphasizing empathy, but we're also holding people accountable. And we can give those reminders at the beginning of a tense situation, right? Because sometimes people will just need to go, okay, and settle back in. That's when we also want to recalibrate. We want to like really check for understanding, because I have just found that usually people will make that statement but not have anything to base it on. And they'll make the statement because maybe they watch Fox News and that's what's modeled to them, because they've never heard it as a question. And it doesn't mean they don't want to ask it as a question. They just have never considered it a question. So that sort of recalibration and that like the little bit of back and forth that we do can really make a difference. Especially I have found like paraphrasing and repeating it back to people. Like, I'm just checking for understanding here, but it sounds like you're asking blah. Oftentimes they'll be like, oh no, that's not what I mean at all. And wow, that sounds really bad now that I hear it back from you, right? Like those, we need to rely on those kinds of things in those situations, because the biggest thing that we want to do is slow it down, is to completely slow down the pace of that moment, even when our hearts are racing, okay? And then we can then be choosy about how we respond. In those moments, we're going to have to make a decision about how we protect people who are vulnerable in our classes. So I'm going to be immediately mindful of, okay, this conversation can impact those 3 people over there. And I'm going to keep an eye on them, right? I'm going to watch for them. I'm going to remind the class that if you need to leave for your own comfort and safety, you do that without asking, and give people that option. Sometimes we can redirect attention. Sometimes we can invite private conversations, but sometimes we have to ask people to leave. Again, this is a middle school example, but I had a student who was being very, very dysregulated to the point of violence and would not leave the classroom. And I'm not about to pick up this person and take them outside. I said, so you're staying here no matter what? Yes. So the rest of us left Jacob in there. Pseudonym, obviously. But we have to know where our exit strategies are. Like when it comes to protecting my students, I need to be able to make those quick things. But I can also delay those conversations. If I don't know the answer or I need to desperately buy time, we can say like, that is a huge topic and this morning I don't feel prepared to talk about it. So I'm going to do some reading and I promise that we'll come back. It gives people a chance to collect their thoughts and for you to maybe check in with people and figure out the best way to move forward. And then the last thing is about how do we repair when damage has happened? Because it's going to happen, right? That people are going to be hurt or confused or upset or enraged. There's going to be emotions to deal with afterwards. And when you've had a disruption in your class that has the potential for harm, it is important to spend some time repairing that space. So it means checking in, offering apologies, bringing back to, reteaching some of the skills, connecting people with services. And maybe it's a student that you just can't quite reach, or, you're just like, you're like this. That's when you team in your mentors and your friends and folks like me on campus who can help to facilitate those conversations. Because it's really important that you recognize that you don't have to do this stuff alone. And then sometimes you just have to say no. Sometimes you have to say that is a completely inappropriate comment. We do not tolerate that kind of ABCD in this space. Maybe they need to leave, or maybe it just needs a firm no and for you to move on, because your obligation is to protect the majority, especially the vulnerable. Okay. And that is through policy, but that's also our ethical responsibility as just good humans. Okay. Yeah, Leah, take care. I'm almost done anyways. I'll talk to you soon. Okay. We don't have time for questions, unfortunately, but I am willing to stick around for a bit if people would like to. We can be best friends in a number of ways. Add me on social media. You can see all my terrible dad jokes. But this is how to get a hold of us. Christy Benson, who's in here as well, is also in the center with me and can support you with a number of these things.